Tom Grundy is editor-in-chief of the Hong Kong Free Press. He told me how Google had justified its move.
Google told us today that it complies with applicable US sanctions and laws and enforces related policies under its terms of service. Basically, John Lee, the presumed next leader of the city, was among 11 Hong Kong and Chinese officials sanctioned by the US in August 2020 for undermining Hong Kong's autonomy, restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of its citizens. This was when he was security minister. Until recently, he was Hong Kong number 2. He was said to be involved in coercing, arresting, detaining and imprisoning people during the 2019 pro-democracy unrest and protests. Chief Executive Carrie Lam, the current leader, was also sanctioned back then and barred from using paid-for tools on Facebook. And the banks have also snubbed her, and she's had to be being paid in cash. She complained of having wads of Hong Kong dollars around her home. And John Lee is very likely to be in a similar situation. And now today, he's had his YouTube channel deleted entirely. It's a case of compliance catching up.
I mean, it's interesting. A spokesman for Meta, who control Facebook, they're saying Mr. Lee can run his campaign on their platforms as long as he maintains a demonetized presence. So it's as though they have a slightly different reading of the sanctions rules.
Carrie Lam throughout this, also sanctioned, has had a Facebook presence, but when it comes to boosting or sponsoring using those paid-for tools on the Meta platforms, they can't use them. Bear in mind, this is a Facebook town. We're not under the Great Firewall like in China, so reverting to the likes of WeChat or other mainland Chinese platforms is not very viable, really.
John Lee's campaign office director has called the moves totally unreasonable, regretful. I mean, do you think they're going to make much of a dent or change anything in practical terms?
Bear in mind, when we talk about this kind of thing, John Lee doesn't have to convince anyone. It's already in the bag. He is the sole candidate. It's a one-horse race meant to take place in 18 days. He's yet to put out a manifesto, but only 0.02% of the population actually get a vote.
For the likes of Google and Facebook, I guess there's a balancing act to be done here, isn't there? Because they have their wider relationship with Beijing to worry about. There must be a fear, I guess, on the part of the tech giants that this could drive, well, on the one hand, Hong Kong regulators to retaliate against US tech firms, but also perhaps Beijing to do the same too.
Tech firms are stuck between a bit of a rock and a hard place. Do they upset the local authorities or do they comply with the US sanctions? At the moment, it's a no-brainer. But in the future, they may need to think about not only their future presence in Hong Kong on Chinese soil, but also their staff here, who could also face pressure. And what happens if these companies themselves are sanctioned, by China or Hong Kong? I mean, it says something perhaps about the city's dwindling status as a free speech haven in Asia, because for decades, companies would set themselves up here because they wouldn't face the kind of censorship or pressure that you'd expect in the mainland under the Great Firewall. This is why some media outlets like Initium have moved operations to the likes of Singapore, which is no free speech paradise, but it's more predictable perhaps.
Do you think indirectly this could have a spin-off impact on Hong Kong as a major Asian financial center as well?
One pro-Beijing lawmaker today was saying that the government should engage in solemn negotiations with Google and that this was interference by foreign forces in the Hong Kong election. But we are 2 years into this national security crackdown in light of the 2019 protests, and the selection of this former police officer, this former security chief, says something about how Beijing views Hong Kong, perhaps as a troublesome periphery where this clampdown may continue. There are big questions really over John Lee. We are expecting a fake news law under his watch, regulation of crowdfunding, which many media rely on, and Article 23, a local version of the security law. So who knows, in the months or years to come, if we will see more along the lines of the full-blown censorship that you are used to in mainland China.
Tom Grundy speaking to me from Hong Kong.